name is Marco Hatch. I'm an assistant professor in environmental science at the Huxley College of Environment at Western Washington University, and we're here today to study clam gardens. Clam gardens are special spots in the intertidal where, for thousands of years, up and down the coast from Washington to southeast Alaska, indigenous people have modified the environment, have modified the intertidal and nearshore environment for the purpose of growing more clams. So many of these clam gardens exist on what were formerly steep beaches, and you can roll rocks to the low tide line and take that steep beach and flatten it out. And that creates more clam habitat, and these flat beaches are right in what we call the Goldilocks zone for clams. If the clams live too high in the tide line, they dry out and die. If they live too low, the sea stars eat them. So for thousands of years, people have modified the environment to open up more space for clams in the ideal habitat, in the ideal zone that these clams like to live. To my knowledge, clam gardens are pretty exclusive to the northwest coast. However, there's really synonymous technologies used, for example, in Hawaii around fish ponds. Similar sort of idea of making a rock wall. There you're putting fish in and letting them grow out. Stone fish traps, which are also used in this area, are kind of similar as well. So clam gardens offer this really interesting opportunity to look at sea level rise because of what I mentioned, that they're built in a really narrow part of the intertidal, that they're really, really specific down to just a few centimeters of where they're placed. So we can look at and date these rock wall features and understand that when that rock wall was built, it was built at the proper clam habitat. It was built at that sea level. And now, depending on where you are, you'll see clam gardens that are way too deep for clams now, and you'll see some that are way up high on the shore. And that gives us an idea of how sea levels changed in that local environment. Some areas, sea level has risen quite a lot over the past 5,000 or 6,000 years, and in other areas, sea levels actually dropped over 5,000 or 6,000 years. So clam gardens follow that tide line up or down depending on what's happening locally. So every clam has its own unique habitat. A certain kind of flow, a certain kind of temperature, or a certain kind of sediment. And so there's a lot of engineering that goes into, and a lot of ecological knowledge that goes into trying to propagate or create good habitats for these areas. And one thing you notice right away when you walk around on clam garden versus a non-clam garden is that clam garden sediments, the actual sand within the beach, tends to be quite a lot different than what you see in other areas. Clam gardens tend to have a lot more shell. Shell hash will be white, kind of flaky, and it turns out that clams really, really like that sort of sediment. That white calcium carbonate shells and barnacles let water flow through more easily, and clams just really, really like that area compared to maybe like a mud beach or kind of a muckier beach. So that's a big part of it, as is turning the sediments over to help wash away some of the fine-grained organic matter and keep the sediment healthy. So while all beaches might look the same, there's these really small habitat differences that often come down to the sediment. And the other big thing is water flow. So clams eat phytoplankton. So they need lots of water swishing back and forth, providing them food every day. And so you could think of it like hamburgers on a conveyor belt, right? So some areas the conveyor belts are real slow, and other areas that current's real fast, and it's just force feeding them hamburgers, hamburgers, hamburgers. In this case, phytoplankton. So when you start to look at where these clam gardens are placed, and look at the currents and look at the habitat, you find out that these are always the ideal spot for clams. That it's more than just, well, here's a beach, let's make a clam garden. It's thinking about what are the currents like, what is the wave energy like, what does the water quality look like, and what tide height, where do we build this wall to within centimeters to be the perfect spot for clams. And so there's actually tons and tons of different pieces that go into that. The Coastal Communities Ecology Lab at Western Washington University has been engaged in clam garden research for a number of years. This year we're really trying to understand mechanistically why we see more and happier clams in clam gardens compared to non-clam gardens. Here on Quadra, within just one small bay, there's probably 20+ clam gardens. So it's a really intensely managed ecosystem with a lot of effort put into figuring out how to grow the most number of clams in a small area. There's a big restoration project happening in the southern Gulf Islands where 2 clam gardens that hadn't been managed for quite a while are now being re-managed by indigenous people. That these features, these clam gardens, very similar to the garden in your backyard, need constant maintaining, need constant management. that the rocks kind of wash away from the rock wall. The sediments need to be turned over, just like you turn over the soil in your backyard garden. We're now seeing a resurgence of interest in clam gardens and management of clam gardens. Additionally, there's a Washington tribe that's looking at perhaps creating a new clam garden. And this is in response to sea level rise and trying to create a clam beach that will be adaptive to sea level rise and will help ensure that they have access to good clam resources right next to the reservation. So I often wonder, why am I studying clams? It's been a through theme since my graduate work, using clams found in archaeological sites as environmental indicators for looking at ocean change over thousands of years. Clams offer this really interesting opportunity to look at many different things through the viewpoint of a clam. So clam health is related to ocean conditions, it's related to the watershed. Everything that's happening in the watershed and washes off land into the ocean impacts clams. They're impacted by climate change, by increasing harmful algal blooms or red tides, sea level rise, coastal erosion, and they're an important food resource too. Both now and traditionally, clams have been and do play a very important role in subsistence and ceremony, and they have a lot of importance. And so it's one species that exists in many different areas up and down the coast, but depending on what angle you take can mean many different things. So I don't know if I'm going to be studying clams in 20 years. I wonder that myself. But I think that being able to look at them from various perspectives really opens up lots of different questions. And so it's not just clams. We're not just studying clams for the sake of studying clams, but we're using clams as a gateway to ask these different questions. In this case, is clam health related to indigenous management, and what about those practices can we continue to help promote the healthy environments? And so can we learn from clams, and what lessons can we learn, and can we apply more broadly in a modern context?